How is Zed annoying? Talon is way more annoying than Zed, in your opinion? Well, buddy, that's your opinion. That's the problem, right? Your opinion doesn't match the opinion of the vast majority of League of Legends players. And that's the issue. Zed is frequently one of the most banned champions in the game, which is not true for Talon. Zed right now, as an example, at a 48% win rate, has a 22% ban rate. He is a top 6 banned champion. Now imagine this character had a 50% win rate. His ban rate probably goes to the moon, and we've seen this year after year after year. This is a combination of his popularity, he has a very popular character, and a combination of his pattern. At the end of the day, well, a lot of people will tell you Talon is more frustrating, and their reason will be things like, oh, Talon just one-shots me, and that's all he does. Well, Zed does something even worse. Zed tortures you. Zed ults you, he puts the death mark on you, he does a few swipes, he teleports away, puts on his sunglasses, and 2 seconds later you explode, right? It turns out that for most players, that series of events, even though it had more counterplay and more things you could do against him during that time, that series of events is significantly more frustrating to die to than Talon just showing up and stabbing you once and you're dead. We learned this actually when we did the Assassin update. We kind of had this bet years and years and years ago when we updated all the Assassins in the game that players were frustrated by being bursted. And so if we just made all the Assassins give time to react, that players would be less frustrated by Assassins. But actually the opposite happened. Players ended up being more frustrated by Assassins because the only thing that's more frustrating than dying instantly to an Assassin is dying over 3 seconds to 1. And then also Talon actually just isn't that great in lane. And so a lot of people who are out there banning Zed are banning him because of things like, oh, I played against Zed in lane and this was a miserable experience for me as a player because of all these things he could do. Whereas Talon, his laning phase actually isn't that ridiculous. You're kind of just like, I'm going to bully this guy. So there's probably stuff like that as well going on. Yeah, you buy one chain vest and his damage goes in the dumpster. So Zed is a really interesting study from a game design perspective on reality of counterplay versus perceived counterplay. And so what I mean by this is, historically, if you talk to a lot of designers and you were to ask them hey, what is one of the best counterplay assassins in League of Legends? Zed would actually come up very high on the list. Zed legitimately has a lot of very real counterplay. You can buy a chain vest, as you said, but also his ultimate gives you time to react. He has skill shots to dodge, etc., etc., etc. The reality of Zed's counterplay is that it's actually quite high in the grand scheme of assassins, compared to say a Talon or a Rengar as an example. And so the objective counterplay of Zed would indicate that he's a very fair and balanced and non-frustrating champion. Look at all the counterplay, right? But the reality is that's not the case. The reality is that he is the most frustrating assassin in the game, and it tends to not be close. And so that's a question then you have to ask yourself is well, if this guy has some of the best counterplay for assassins, what's going on here? Why is he so frustrating regardless of the fact that he has a lot of counterplay? And the reality is there's a lot of counterplay. A lot of counterplay can't be perceived by players. That's one of them. And so it doesn't matter how easy your character is to counter if the average player who experiences it cannot interpret that counterplay and use it. So a really easy example of this was, a decade ago when EVELYN had permanent stealth. She had very easy counterplay, which was buy a pink ward. But no one wanted to do that. Buying a pink ward to counter EVELYN wasn't fun. So we ended up removing her permanent stealth that she used to have because we couldn't balance the game we couldn't balance her counterplay around that because people, even if it existed, didn't want to engage in that type of counterplay. And so it's kind of this thing where it's counterplay only matters if players engage in it and it's the type of counterplay that they actually are interested in engaging in, right? And so Zed has this thing where despite having counterplay, players don't really perceive it to be very real. And you get a character who tends to be very, very, very frustrating. And then, to me, it ties back to, despite having counterplay, Zed has this issue of being, what's the word? He tortures you. His counterplay is incredibly feels bad when you can't access it, right? Again, it's this concept that, it's the only thing more frustrating than dying instantly to Zed is Zed ulting you, doing a bunch of stuff, and then teleporting away and you dying 3 seconds later. Even if that 3 seconds gave you more time to react, gave you more time to be shielded, heal, play around him, right? The instances where you die to that are significantly more frustrating. It feels like there was less you could have done as opposed to more. And so, yeah, it's an interesting spot with Assassins. I don't feel a problem getting outplayed by Zed. I would rather face Zed every game than Brand, Syndra, Xerath, Hwei for once a day. And Starlexis, that's like totally a legitimate like way to think about the game, right? Like if you ask a lot of high-elo players as an example, one of the characters they will legitimately tell you is frustrating when strong is MALPHITE. Now, many high-elo players will not tell you he's frustrating right now as an example, because most of the time, MALPHITE isn't frustrating, like, strong in high-elo. But if there's metas where MALPHITE is strong in high-elo, a lot of high-elo players will tell you, like, it's really frustrating that MALPHITE is strong. And the reason they'll tell you that is because when MALPHITE is strong, there's no counterplay, right? A strong MALPHITE just kind of clicks you and GG, right? Like that's and that's a very legitimate way to think. I'm not saying you're wrong for being like, I'd prefer to play against characters with counterplay. But the thing is like, in terms of how many players experience the game, most players tend to be a lot less frustrated by the champions who are like honest with you, is what I would say. Like most players who play League of Legends, when they die to a MALPHITE, they're like, well, here's what he was good at and here's what he's bad at, and like I can grok that, etc. Like that's the majority of player experience when they interact with MALPHITE is not like, oh, there was no counterplay. There was like, well, here's what he's good at and here's what he's bad at, and I lost the thing he's bad at. Whereas like most players, the things they get really frustrated at in League of Legends are characters like YASUO and Zed, who do all these flashy things you can dodge and teleport around. Oh god, rats! And the end result of that experience was, could you have done more than if like it had been a MALPHITE in the same situation? Yes, you could have. MALPHITE doesn't really have anything to dodge, a 60 ult, and like you can only really flash it. Whereas Yasuo and Zed have a lot more things going on that you can actually play around. But the experience of playing around them and having them dance circles around you tends to be, for most players in League, significantly more frustrating than like, yeah, and JANNA shielded that guy and made it so they couldn't die. Now, this actually raises a question though, because that doesn't necessarily mean that a character like MALPHITE is a better design than a character like Zed. Like, for starters, MALPHITE and Zed are both great designs for their own reasons, right? But you might think from this, like, so is it better to just design characters that are just really straightforward because then most people won't be frustrated like them compared to the dashers? But, like, that's not the case. Like, as an example, if I wanted to design a character that had the least frustration at the highest win rate, can anybody guess how I would do that? So, again, the question for chat is, if I wanted to design a character that was very high win rate and very low frustration, what should I do? Does anybody have any ideas? Anybody got any ideas? Enchanter, Team Aura support, Sona clone, low skill expression, JANNA. Yeah, actually, these are great examples. I would make a character with old JANNA passive. Old JANNA passive red, your entire team gains 3% move speed. And so this is the beauty of that passive. A, it's insanely powerful. A global aura is nuts. Very, very strong. And the other beauty of that passive in terms of frustration is when the Jax top lane uses that 3% move speed to kill you, who are you mad at? Are you mad at the JANNA or are you mad at the Jax? You're mad at the Jax, right? And so JANNA in this situation where she globally gives everybody 3% move speed, she offloads her frustration onto other characters. And so the reason I'm like talking about this is like, the best game is not the game with the least frustrating characters. Because it turns out that the way to get the least frustrating characters actually is like, in its own way, some very problematic game design. Doesn't mean we can't have auras in the game, but it's just saying that like, if my one goal as a designer was to make a character as powerful as possible, well, as least frustrating, as unfrustrating as possible, I'm probably actually making some questionable designs. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that Zed is frustrating. He's an assassin. That's what he's supposed to be. It's not a bad thing that Yasuo is frustrating. He dashes around a lot, and that's fine. Like, that makes for a good game. A lot of people like Yasuo. They like playing Yasuo. They like playing characters like Yasuo, and there are some people who like playing against characters like Yasuo as well. So the question in these cases isn't, oh, how can we always make the least frustrating character? But it's more like, you know, what types of characters makes sense for with what types of frustration. And there's also just a limit. And like the reason we talk about Zed a lot on this stream is that Zed is the character who runs up against the limit for frustration we tend to have in the game. Any thoughts on Chinese Zed ban rate versus Western? They don't seem as phased. Yeah, so it's just a real thing that Chinese players tend to be way less frustrated by characters like Zed and Yasuo and things like that. Like, it's a very East versus West thing to some degree. Western players tend to be way more frustrated by the outplay of champs, whereas Chinese and Korean players tend to be frustrated more by, like, other stuff. Western players really hate getting run circles around. That said, Zed has an average ban rate that's high all over the world. So while Chinese players are less frustrated by Zed, Zed on average does tend to have like a real ban rate in most regions. And how we tend to balance the game is based on like average ban rates, meaning that like we consider what China looks like, we consider what Korea looks like, we consider America, we consider EU, things like that, right? And so a lot of our balancing is done based on the average of all the regions. And the reason we do that is like, if a character is banned in one region but not another, it usually means that there's just some difference in the meta, and it probably doesn't mean they're all that OP necessarily. They might be, but like it also means it's like, hey, if you're banned one place but not another, that probably means that like some region has found out how to play against you or like feels okay about it, right?